I thought I would start by just talking a little bit about why I decided to apply for the Marie-Curie funding in the first place. So I got my PhD in Norway, and I was offered a 5-year research position with a really good group there. But I mean, I knew that that was an amazing opportunity, but I had this need to try to develop my own research project from scratch and see if I could get it funded. And more importantly, to go somewhere new. You know, experience a whole new research community and get new ideas. See things from a new perspective. And as I'm hoping you're getting the impression of now, the Marie Curie funding is ideal for that. So I only started my project in August last year, but I've gotten so much out of this experience that I'm really glad that I decided to take the chance and put in the time and effort that it took to get the proposal ready and get the funding. But I'm here to talk about my research, which has to do with non-breeders, or birds without babies, like this sad little guy here. And I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of background to the field and why this might be important. So population ecology is all about understanding the processes that drive populations, why they grow, why they change. And we tend to do this by going out, observing, counting, catching individuals and marking them so that we can recognize them later, measuring various traits, and then making some sort of estimation of important population parameters. And I think that one of the main reasons that we do this is so that we get some kind of tools for predicting how populations might react, how they might be influenced by things like environmental change. So that will then give us what we need in order to properly manage and conserve them. But while I was working with some of these questions, I started to think about the fact that we almost always focus on the breeders. So we go out and we count nests, we go to breeding colonies, and most of the things that we estimate and calculate are based on breeders. But it turns out that in a lot of different populations, in any given year, there will be a large number of individuals that don't breed. And these pictures just show you some examples of species in which this has been found. And as you can see, it's not only birds, although I'm focusing on birds here in this presentation. Now, the thing about these non-breeders is that they don't necessarily hang around in the same areas as the breeders. If you're not breeding, you don't necessarily need to be at the breeding colony. And that means that when we go out and study these populations, we don't necessarily find these. And even if they are there, we kind of tend to ignore them a bit because we're so focused on the breeders. So then the question is, does that matter? Is that important? And because we see these so seldom or spend so little time on studying them, we know very little about them. So in my project, I'm trying to learn more about these non-breeders and what role they might play in populations. I'm looking at population dynamics, which is basically how populations grow or decline and their extinction risk. And there are two main ways, two very obvious ways that non-breeders might affect this. One is simply that individuals that aren't breeding at the moment might be future breeders. So they might actually be very important for the population. But at the same time, these non-breeders could be negative for the population if they're competing for the same resources as the breeders. So if you have a lot of non-breeders around, that might actually be decreasing the productivity of the population and the success of the breeders. I'm also looking at population genetics. So we know that in small populations, it's better for the genetic health of the population to have offspring production that is evenly distributed among individuals, so that there are more individuals that contribute genes to future populations. That's because we want to keep up genetic variation. That's good for the populations. Which means that there will be a very big difference in populations in which individuals basically take turns breeding so that they switch between being breeders and non-breeders, and one in which the same individuals breed basically throughout their lifetime, and the non-breeders are some sort of doomed surplus that are never going to get to breed. And finally, I'm going to look a little bit at something that's called a buffer mechanism, which is something that has been suggested as a reason for having non-breeders. The basic idea is that if something bad were to happen to the breeding population, if there's some sort of environmental event that wipes out a large part of the breeding population, then having the non-breeders around means that you have new individuals to come in and take over the breeding so that the total productivity of the population doesn't change as much. Now, I'm studying these questions through a combination of theoretical modeling and work on analyzing empirical data from two very different populations. One of them is green-rumped parrotlets in Venezuela. These have been studied. It's two very closely linked populations that have been studied by Steve Beisinger's lab at UC Berkeley, which is where I'm based right now. The other one is the European shag, which is a type of cormorant, a seabird, in Scotland, which is being studied by researchers at the Center for Ecology and Hydrology in Edinburgh, and Jane Reed's group at the University of Aberdeen, which is where I'll be going after my 2 years here. The green-rumped parrotlet data set is pretty amazing. These birds have been studied now for 25 years. Researchers spend several months, actually many months, every year going to the field site and watching these birds, recording all the breeding that takes place, marking all the new individuals, and recording which birds are there, who they're mated with, what they're doing. Now, because the non-breeders in this population tend to hang out in roughly the same area as the breeders, we also have a lot of observations of non-breeders. In this population, non-breeding males actually outnumber breeding males in most years. It's a very skewed sex ratio, so there are a lot of excess males. But at the same time, in some years, you can have up to a quarter of the pairs that actually are also not breeding. So even if a male manages to get a mate, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to breed. The estimated rate from what we know so far of transitions between breeding and non-breeding classes is about 30%, which means that there is movement between them. But from what people have told me who have been working with these birds for a long time, the typical path for an individual seems to be, at least for males, that they don't breed when they're young, and then at some point, some of them become breeders, and as they start to get old, they go back to being non-breeders. Now, one of the things that I find particularly fascinating in this population is that they've observed that non-breeding males actually go together in pairs. So this data is also special because they're recording social interactions when they see them. And these non-breeders go together in male-male pairs that behave very much like breeding pairs, except of course they're not breeding. And they also tend to hang out in small groups. So one of the things that I'm really eager to find out is if these social constellations affect the probability of breeding for the individuals. The other population is quite different. This is a breeding colony on the Isle of May outside of Edinburgh. This is a picture from the colony. And I mention the breeding colony because that's where the focus has been in this study. It's been studied for a very long time, but the focus has always been on the breeding. But recently, they've also started to pay more attention to the non-breeders, partly because of this project. Following them, trying to find out where they go and what they do. Because in this population, non-breeders don't usually hang out at the breeding colony. At least there are a lot of them that don't. Now, here again, age at first breeding is very variable. So there are a lot of young non-breeders. But then at the same time, the adults quite often just skip a year, don't breed for a year, and then go back to breeding again. So in any given year, you have about 5% of adults that just aren't breeding. And then in addition, we have these maybe every 5 to 10 years or so. There will be a year with particularly bad environmental conditions, and you can have up to 60% of the adult population not breeding. We call them non-breeding events. So these two populations, and these two quite amazing data sets really, it's not that common to find populations that have been studied so well for so long. They represent a very good opportunity to study different types of non-breeders. Now, unfortunately, I've only just started working with the parrotlet data, so I don't have any exciting results to tell you about from this portion of the study yet. But what I have done is to develop some theoretical models to compare different types of systems with different types of non-breeders in them. And I'm going to represent that just with this very simple life cycle here. So this represents, we have some juvenile classes. Individuals have a certain probability of surviving and moving up. Once they reach an age of here 3, they have a probability of becoming either a breeder or a non-breeder. And in subsequent years, any survivors will either stay in the class that they're in or switch to the other class. And then only breeders produce offspring. Everything that happens in this system is controlled by probabilities. So we're taking random events into account. And this is something, these kinds of life cycles can be translated very easily into matrices, which can then be analyzed for things like population dynamics and extinction risk. And that's basically what I've done, although in a large variety of systems, most of which are more complicated than this. And interestingly, what I find is that I get very much the same patterns and the same results in all the different systems. So looking at, for example, which parameters are more important for population growth, I come up with the same results in different systems. And it seems like there are underlying common mechanisms that can explain this and can be used for drawing inferences about populations. I'm not going to tell you about these results in detail. If anyone's interested, I'm always happy to discuss it over lunch. But I just want to mention also that I find that the population organization, so the way that individuals move between these different classes and what these probabilities are, can actually affect extinction risk, even if the expected growth rate is the same. And finally, I find that including non-breeders in their own classes, so explicitly including them in the model, can give me different results from what I get even if I include them in the model, if I just classify them as failed breeders. So although my project is in the early stages, the results I'm getting do seem to indicate that these non-breeders are important, that the presence of non-breeders, whether or not we include them in our analyses and how we do it, could be very important for the results of population studies. Thank you.